I'm going to give you a talk which you'll see quite quickly that it goes in several different directions, and I'll need your help probably making sense of it. So please be rude about it. I don't mind, and feel, as I say, feel free. So the talk that I'm going to give, it'll probably be around 45 minutes, and it has three parts to it. And obviously the title is Free States and Fanaticism, and I suppose one way of thinking about it is why do the British and the French think that with regard to liberty the other is mad, and which one's right? Obviously I'm not saying that we can decide anything today, but it's really partly that debate whether Britain or France is the superior free state is at issue, because obviously it matters, especially in the history of free states. I should also say that I don't like the word democracy. I don't like the word democracy because I think it's far too new. And the old word, which is free state, the other reason I don't really like democracy is because the whole purpose of representation is to stop the people from being political agents. So if the purpose of your system of government is to prevent democracy, why call it democracy? There's obviously an old debate, and there could be responses to it, but I think free states is the better term. I also think the history of free states is not necessarily I think the history of free states is often silly. That's obviously a rude thing to say about people who might have written big books. But obviously we used to get, I don't know, obviously the British would call it Whig history, Whig historical accounts. I know that you all know what that means, of histories of liberty, histories of free states, where it's always a success story. Or you get histories where you're looking for elements that mirror the present. Obviously, we're doing that more and more, and moralizing about the past. But what I'm most interested in, the histories of free states that look at the problems, often the problems that haven't been solved, and the problems that you can see over time. Now, the reason that the paper's also slightly complicated and it has these three parts to it is because at St Andrews, I've been very fortunate to have lots of archives that are really the private papers of historians of political thought, and two of the people that I've got a lot of their papers are John Pocock, J.G.A. Pocock, and East Van Hont. And I'm just gonna I'm not going to use the papers much, but I'm just I'll talk a little bit about them. So the reason for this starting with this print, I like this print because it's obviously saying John Bull receives a deputation from Paris, and they say you'd be a lot better off without your head, which is why he's so afraid, and drops his pipe, the weed from his pipe, and looks so worried. And obviously it's one of those kind of characterizations, the British slur on the French Revolution, so many criticisms, are that, the French have gone mad. And but actually, one of the things that I'll focus on is how do you explain it? How do you explain from a British perspective what happens in the French Revolution once you acknowledge it's not 1688? So obviously, when they had celebrations of the French Revolution, the revolution anniversaries in the first year, people like Richard Price thought, the French are having their own glorious revolution of 1688, 1689, following the English, and they're going to do it a lot better. So it's going to be a marvelous thing, rather than acknowledging the fact, which I do think is one of the most key factors explaining the French Revolution right from the outset is the absolute rejection of Britain as a model, free state model. And I think, obviously most of the revolutionaries are explicit about it. I know there's lots of claims about Mounier, being an Anglo-man. I don't buy it when you look at the detail. And it's for the good reason that Britain looks like a failed free state by the end of the 18th century. Obviously, there's lots of predictions that if there's going to be a revolution anywhere, it'll happen in Britain. It's not necessarily going to be in France. After all, Britain's even more bankrupt. It has a mad king. It's just lost at war, obviously, in the American Revolution, and it's internally divided. So there's no surprise that the French revolutionaries don't draw on Britain as a model free state, and I think that's significant. But I want to talk about fanaticism as well, and the accusation that there's a relationship between free states and fanaticism. Now, fanaticism is a word that you use when you've got mad people around. So, and often the people who think they are not fanatics are accused of fanaticism, and vice versa. So in that sense, I guess it's exactly the same as today. But to the 18th century mind, if you wanted to generalize about it, I think one of the interesting things about it is that, there are groups of people that you want to avoid. You want to avoid them, and you want to avoid being them, especially in politics. And one is projectors. Anybody who has a project, and being a projector is related to being a man of system. A man of system is somebody who thinks, well, I've got a box of tricks, I've got a set of laws, I've got a system that if it's applied to the world, it doesn't matter whether it doesn't fit necessarily, you've got to apply it and it'll work perfectly. A projector is obviously somebody who is kind of selling moonshine of one kind or another. But it's often the case that projectors and men of system are enthusiasts. And enthusiasm, as everybody here knows, is a term that is used wonderfully in the 18th century. And you have to worry about enthusiasts, and you have to worry about Protestant and Catholic enthusiasts especially. And this is a quote below that I've just got. It's actually I was going to get you to guess who it is, but actually it's Pocock. You can actually tell the language is so complex. But it says, superstition denoted the worship of God through relics, rituals, intercessors and priesthood. Enthusiasm, the worship of him as immediate to and even in the experience of the worshipper. So in other words, the enthusiast is somebody who feels that they're working for God, and God's on their side, and therefore they can, do transformatory things. And obviously he goes on to say Hume, as somebody in a Protestant culture, had to deal with the conviction that faith and redemption come only through the immediate gift of grace to the elect. And he, obviously, Pocock emphasizes it's different in a Catholic culture. But superstition must tend to support authority, enthusiasm, liberty. But the absolutism of grace must lead to a tyranny of spirit over society. And among the ends of enlightenment, as I was using the word, it comes from letters where we were discussing whether I was right to talk about the end of enlightenment, which triggered him, let's say. As I was using the word, the sovereignty of sociability. Hume ended his account of the English civil wars not as a Tory, but as a supporter of the conservative Enlightenment. Like Voltaire, unless Voltaire learned this from him, he saw how easy the Puritan and millenarian emphasis on Christ alone might be de-spiritualized into an emphasis on Christ the man and author of a society without priests, and might pass through Unitarianism into deism. Now, one of the things that Pocock was obsessed with are societies where enthusiasm becomes so prevalent, and you think that it almost becomes a superstition, that you can that you no longer need, I don't know, let's call it religious, either institutional limits on human action. And in a sense, I think Pocock, even though Pocock's not necessarily a believer, but he studies the effects of atheism, and he worries about the effects of atheism. It's one of the things I'll show you in a minute. Now, the story is, of course, complicated, the story of liberty and fanaticism, because obviously I've just given you a description of fanaticism as something that's the product of either men of system or projectors or enthusiasts especially, and the idea is therefore, liberty itself might become fanatic. You might have fanatic notions of liberty that entail, action without limits, violence, etc. But then the complicating element of the story, as I'm sure some of you have already guessed, is that for somebody like David Hume, who's not a fanatic, even though he's accused of being a fanatic, sometimes partly because he's accused of being an atheist, says, actually, where does English liberty come from? It comes from the Puritans. So, actually, there are Puritan origins, as he says. The precious spark of liberty had been kindled and was preserved by the Puritans alone, and it was this sect whose principles appear so frivolous and habits so ridiculous that the English owe the whole freedom of their constitution. And if you were a kind of, lots of the dissenters in the mid to late 18th century and into the 19th, they use that quote. It becomes a kind of popular epigraph to lots of books. Because they think, actually, it's us. It's the religious establishments who are responsible for the liberty of the British. Now, I'm just going to shift a little bit. Now, why should you be interested in the history of free states? Now, it obviously one motivation might be to show how free we are in the present. So you get kind of histories with titles like The Expanding Blaze, or something. Obviously, I'm thinking about something like, I don't know, Jonathan Israel, where you've got these grand stories. There's a liberty baton, and it's born let's say it's born in the United States, and then it's passed on to the French, and then it's that the fire keeps going. Now, obviously, given that, I don't know, I suppose not many people these days think liberty's in a healthy state, then we're not getting those. I don't know, I can't imagine a world where Jonathan Israel's books cease selling. Publishers in the past have told me that they're only able to publish my books that don't sell because his do. Anyway, it's that kind of, let's say, the Whig historiography of liberty is on a downturn. What else are you looking for in the history of liberty? Obviously, Quentin Skinner, Liberty is Independence, published relatively recently. What does he say? It's the making and unmaking of a political ideal. And his notion of, liberty as non-domination, which is a neo-Roman ideal that he thinks, certainly in Liberty is Independence, he thinks it's the story of the Whigs. It's the story of the Whigs in the early 18th century, and it's maintained, people like Richard Price, Benjamin Vaughan, and lots of others, lots of dissenters, who he thinks were attempting to maintain this notion of liberty, and then it's lost. And he thinks because we need to worry about enslavement, that's the 18th century term for it, then it needs to be recovered. Issues like privacy, etc., which his caste obsess about, and the limits on what governments and he thinks corporations can do to us. So you can see why that's a valid reason. And lots of people, obviously, they interrogate the history of free states, the history of liberty conceptually or in different places, because they think, okay, well, there might be ideas that are useful. And obviously, in Quentin's case, he's not looking for kind of random ideas. He's looking for a tradition. And there's a tradition, partly because he's always wanted to refute Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty, which I think he has. So I think he's rightly pleased and proud. Anyway, you've got that rationale. And then you've obviously got a similar, I think Hannah Arendt, which is obviously notions of the vita activa and active citizenship based on a set of virtues, which is the way that John Pocock was always interpreted when he wrote The Machiavellian Moment, and still in the historiography about Pocock, which I don't expect anybody to know, but it's Pocock often the kind of, he's a follower of Arendt. He cites various works in The Machiavellian Moment. I seem to remember page 509 for some reason. It's coming in my head. Anyway, he does, but actually to say that Pocock is an advocate is a mistake. Partly, one of the main reasons, I think, is that I think Hannah Arendt, and it's something that she shares with somebody like Judith Shklar, really believes that that the United States as a free state can be better than all of the European polities that it's kind of replaced. And I think they're both, especially Judith Shklar, one of the ways of understanding what she was trying to do is to have a genealogy of liberty that ends with the United States. Obviously, there's nothing Whiggish about her, but it's still a defense of liberty in the United States. And although Hannah Arendt, obviously, especially in the 70s, just before she dies, is more critical, it's also the case that she has faith. And whereas Pocock is absolutely different. Pocock never became a US citizen. He remains a New Zealander, which means that he has a British passport until Britain joins the EU, which he wasn't happy about. And then he has a New Zealand passport, and he's very proud of that. And he's very critical, even though he lives in the United States for most of his life. He's much more critical. I think it's one of the keys to understanding what Pocock was doing. So the Machiavellian moment it's interpreted in different ways, and I'm not going to talk about that. But I'm going to mention Hont as well, because Hont's somebody I discovered when I was talking to the master students that they'd never heard of him. And it's extraordinary the way people who are kind of key in your field obviously die and then are forgotten. And you're the only person talking about them. Although, again, as part of because we've got Hont's papers, we've been publishing stuff, and actually 3 or 4 days ago, the book Political Economy from Pufendorf to Marx, it has probably a very boring title. And it only has my name as with at the bottom, because the terrible thing was that the person who did all the work, which was this chap called Lasse Anderson, they wouldn't allow him to edit it on his own because he was young, and so they wanted the names of old lags to be attached in order to justify the publication with CUP, which seemed mad to me. So we insisted that we were only with, but the with amounts to nothing. I have to confess. Anyway, I think that Hont has a slightly different approach to the history of liberty, and that's one of the things that I want to mention as well. So, I want to go back to Pocock briefly, because Pocock, at the end of his life, obviously he dies when he's 99. In his last years of his life, he comes to a kind of interesting conclusion about the 18th century, and his conclusion about the 18th century is that the 18th century is the present. And what he meant by that was that all of the problems that 18th century authors were identifying in the societies in which they were living are our problems. So he wasn't looking for a kind of lost tradition, and he wasn't looking for, he's not trying to identify a Whig story. He was really saying that they saw our world. I suppose he probably would have concluded that they see our world better than we see it. I think he probably would have said that. Anyway, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. Obviously, he's against global populism, but he says, this is 2016, writing an essay for the 40th anniversary of the Machiavellian moment, in which I accord prophetic status to David Hume's dictum that either the nation will destroy public credit or public credit will destroy the nation. It certainly wants to. He then goes on about Brexit and is rude about the British. I don't think the British gave a damn about us once they ceased to be a world power. Talk about New Zealand. We keep that identity for our own reasons, monarchy included. There's a lot I could explain a lot about that. But the main point is about Hume. He thought public credit, we've never solved the problem of government debt, and actually Hume's crisis is upon us. He really did believe it. Says it everywhere. The other thing that he says is here, where he's talking about property. Property was what anchored the mind in reality. Harrington had said so. And as property became speculative and imaginary, so did society. Hume and Burke agreed that as the landed classes lost their grip on public opinion, politics became prone to fantasy and fanaticism, the revolt of the intellect against property. And again, when you were in touch with him in his last years, I was very fortunate to be in touch with him a lot. He, partly because I was sorting out his papers, some of his papers, etc., and lots of his correspondence, he was reading Hume and Burke and then describing the present. And I think I don't know, perhaps you can think about parallels. He was often accused of being a Brexiteer, but he wasn't, or certainly not in any simplistic sense. But he thought intellectual diversity was being drowned out, just as it had been drowned out in the 18th century, partly through the loss of the republics, the collapse of the republics that he thought to be very, very diverse in terms of the cultures that they protected. And he blamed globalization. He blamed the United States. Actually, he thought, and I do think it's one of those major divisions, is whether you think that in the history of liberty, a key event was the collapse of the European powers, so, France and Britain mainly, and their replacement as the dominant free state by the United States, whether you think that was a good thing or a bad thing. And I think Pocock ultimately thought it was a terrible thing, because he thought the cultures of the United States, he didn't think the United States ultimately had liberty cultures. It's kind of a funny thing to say, and I can say more about it if you want me to, but he really thought that it didn't. And therefore he was very pessimistic about the future. Now, I'm going to shift. So one of the issues is, why should we be interested in the history of free states and the history of liberty? Okay. Now, I want to just shift, because one of the responses is to say that in the history of free states, there's an end point, and it's something that's often discussed, and the end point is effectively the history of the small republics. So the history of the small republics that were all called free states, let's say in early modern times, and then which change or cease to exist by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So obviously Poland, Lithuania, but the old Swiss Confederation, the Dutch Republic, Venice, Genoa, Geneva, they all either ceased to be free states, or the nature of their ideas about liberty that sustain the state, I suppose, they all undergo transformation. And it's one of the things that actually, when he wrote the Machiavellian Moment, a lot of people asked Pocock, well, why didn't you study the French Revolution? And obviously, he very rarely writes about the French Revolution. It's only on a couple of occasions, and he just says really that he doesn't know anything about it and he's not interested in it. But somebody like Judith Sklar once said to him, but the history of the Commonwealth men, the history of the Republican traditions that you're identifying, it ends with the French Revolution. So this is a story of the history of liberty which ends because small states can no longer maintain themselves and their entire identities are dependent on large states. So that you've got a small state history of free states which ends, and therefore I guess everything changes. Now, I want to go back to the French Revolution and just very quickly look at this issue of fanaticism and this link between religious ideas and the politics of the French Revolution. Because it's the way that revolutionary republicanism was perceived, especially in Britain, but you also find it across the continent. You find it in lots of places. Anyone who's critical, not everyone who's critical of the French Revolution saw it in these terms. But it's. I'll just quickly, very, very quickly cover it. So, this is obviously the tree of liberty must be planted immediately. I always say the same thing about this print. I like it because it looks like Boris Johnson. Obviously, it's actually Charles James Fox. Now, there's a quote from Gibbon, which is basically saying, again, it's that the French have gone mad. They had a very successful aristocracy, church, and monarchy, and that's the basis of any rational society, and they've got rid of it. How mad. Another interpretation comes with, these accounts of the history of atheism, where you fit the French Revolution into histories of kind of fanatic atheism, and you blame a certain philosophy. It's Epicureanism. The atheism of Epicurus gained footing at Rome. Its prevalence was followed by scenes of prescription, confiscation, and blood, as were then unparalleled in the history of the world. And he goes on, an attempt has recently been made to establish a similar system in France, and the consequences of which are too well known. So that kind of argument is prevalent. But I do want to focus on one thing only, and I'll be very, very quick about it, because it was one of the things that I emphasised when I was in Paris last June, and it is that the way that the British, who are critics of the French Revolution, think of French republicanism is of being a return to the fires of the Reformation. And in lots of the prints, you always see devils, and you always see fire, and you usually see priests or bishops being killed. And it's because, from the British perspective, it's as if the French revolutionaries, our Puritans, are creating a republic. And one of the ways of the way that it's perceived is that the French have become Protestants, right? Radical Protestants. Now, what I mean by the French have become radical Protestants is that if you are a radical Protestant, you create a church, you're an enthusiast for a church, and you are fanatic about your church. You want everybody to join the church. Every member of the church is expected to behave in the same way. And then the church splits into two churches, and then One of those churches may become dominant, one may go off, but it'll split again and then split again. So the perception of the history of French republicanism is the history of Protestantism. Obviously, in politics, without France turning Protestant. And that's the way it's perceived. Now, you can see a bit of it here. This is obviously the witches scene from Macbeth. I think it's a marvellous print. Again, we have Charles James Fox imbibing the French spirits. And obviously, what are the French spirits doing to you? If you imbibe, they will explain that fanaticism is ahead. Obviously, fanaticism is at the top. Then we have some, illustrations of violence, etc. But you've got the burning of churches, and you've got hell, and you've got devils. Now, you can see it again in this. I think this print is also fantastic. The apotheosis of Hoche. There's a lot going on in this Gilray print from 1798. Unfortunately, I haven't got time to talk about it. But this is another print. Obviously, this is a Rowlandson, Philosophy Run Mad, a stupendous monument of human wisdom. I don't want to talk about the print or anything to do with it. I just want to emphasize that what do you have in the middle? It's the fires of the Reformation are being returned to. So in other words, the French Revolution is an instant in Protestant fanatic enthusiastic history. And it means that it won't last. Obviously, that is the prediction. In the same way that the fires of the Reformation burned out. Again, this is another example. Again, obviously, you have to have the fire, and you have to have the death of the priests. Obviously, the idea that burning somebody is terrible. Effectively, you are being burned, even though you are being guillotined. So, just back to this point about the collapse of the republics. It is the case that the republics. You have to feel sorry for 18th century republicans, and some republicans, small state republicans, really hate the French Revolution. They hate the fact that kind of plans for cosmopolitanism end up in the destruction and incorporation of republics in bigger polities, and it's the case that every strategy that they embrace to try and maintain themselves as republics, they all fail. So, the Genevans spend a fortune on their walls. And they're never going to manage to defend Geneva. And they realise that. So, significantly, when the Genevans go to the Congress of Vienna, obviously Geneva ceases to be an independent republic in 1798. When the Genevans go to the Congress of Vienna, they ask to become Scots. Right. The last thing that I'll do, as long as I don't go over time, is explain why the Genevans asked to become Scots at the Congress of Vienna. Obviously, the only republic that's left is San Marino, a town set upon a rock, and that. So in other words, one of the questions about, I suppose, small state republicanism, which includes republican confederations. The Dutch. It's not as if the Dutch or the Swiss were able to maintain themselves militarily. Whether it's an end story. So actually, you have to start the story of the modern history of free states with the end of old ideas about free states, and that's something that I think is significant. So I want to come back to Hont, who nobody remembers, and because he had, again, he's another author who writes in a complex way, so it's hard to work out exactly what's going on. When he died, I mean, obviously he's a historian of reason of state, right? And he knows that kind of humans are also sharks, and and people thought that he didn't write, right? That he spent his time just kind of thinking and then not writing. When he died, we discovered kind of a couple of book manuscripts and 36 finished articles, and he was never made a professor. I mean, he almost became a professor at Harvard, which is an interesting story, but he didn't. And if he'd published, I don't know, 10 of these 36 articles, he would have ascended the greasy academic pole. But he didn't, and it's because he was a perfectionist. But obviously we've ended up with them at least. I mean, one of the interesting things, which I do think is interesting when some people leave papers, is that when we first put these papers together, I'm saying we, it was actually Lasse Anderson, he got in touch with some of Hont's friends, and they said, and he put together a chronology of all of these unpublished works, and he said, this is what he was working on, and he is an example, and he is an example. And the friends responded by saying, no, he wasn't. He wasn't working on this at this time. You've got it completely wrong. And it turned out, and the thing that really interested them was that they thought that some of the papers were so marvellous that if they'd known about them, then their own careers, because they were working on some of the similar subjects, would have been, improved by engagement with Istvan. Anyway, Lasse was able to prove that it was the case that he just didn't talk to anybody about the things that he was doing, and obviously he didn't publish it. So it was on a hard drive that he actually wanted it to be destroyed, and his wife very generously gave it to us, and then this wonderful scholar Lasse Anderson spent lockdown with Istvan Hont's hard drive, and emerged psychologically intact, which is extremely positive. Anyway, Hont writes The Jealousy of Trade in 2005, but it's a collection of his essays. But he had significant things to say about the history of free states, especially, and I just want to mention some of them. Now, what Hont thought was that when trade became a reason of state, and obviously it's Hume's is the most famous description of that transformation. The world changed at the end of the 17th century because commerce became a reason of state. All nations pursue trade, and obviously these are quotes from Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun, who was obviously unhappy about this. He was opposed to the union between England, Scotland and Wales. And Fletcher predicts that there's just going to be endless wars. There's going to be wars for trade. Whereas in the past, the argument is that the first wars for trade, I mean, some people say obviously it's Colbert, etc., but it's, the English and the Dutch fighting in the 1670s. They're wars for the jealousy of trade. And the prediction is that you're in a different epoch. Obviously, one of the major consequences is that small states, whereas in the past, if you're medium-sized or a large power, you wouldn't necessarily be bothered about small states, but now you want their markets. So if you want their markets, then you're going to have a turn to empire. I know, somebody like Jennifer Pitt's wonderful book about the turn to empire in the 19th century. The turn to empire occurs in the 18th century. It occurs when commerce becomes a reason of state, and it plays out. So Hont supported this idea of histories of liberty, especially obviously ancient ideas about liberty. I mean, Hont thought the Romans completely irrelevant to the 18th century. People are interested in the decline and fall of Rome because of luxury, which can be mapped on to commerce as reason of state. But he thought that the big change was really that Commercial states historically have always been defeated militarily by agrarian empires. And once that changed, once Carthage begins to defeat Rome, obviously some people think Britain's Carthage, some people think it's the Dutch Republic for a short period of time, the world's changed. Obviously, why does commerce become a reason of state? Because of the military revolution, you need to pay for your increasingly expensive armaments that allow you to fight wars. Virtue is no longer relevant because no matter how many massed ranks of virtuous citizens you've got, ultimately it depends on the artillery who can blast them to pieces, and that's expensive. Obviously, ships with cannons allow you to do incredible amounts of damage and to go to places you couldn't go before. So the world changes. So Hont's view really was that it changes completely, and it's a profound importance for the history of liberty. Now, one of the points about Britain in the 18th century that I think a lot of people get wrong is that it's very hard to find anybody who thought Britain was going to survive. And I actually think the best guide, one of the best guides, is Montesquieu, because Montesquieu predicts Britain's collapse just like everybody else, no matter how pleasant he is in Book 11 of De l'Esprit. This print really sums it up. You've got monopoly and oppression. You've got social division because the English and the Scots are fighting each other. You've got the Irish, obviously with the harp, Hibernia, and is expiring. The devil's going to take them all to hell, but not yet. That's Bute and William Pitt at the top with the gout. But you've got John Wilkes on the right-hand side. Obviously, he's written his 45th North Britain, again explaining why there's no liberty left. And the only rational thing to do is to go away to America. So you have to leave the country. And this is at the time of the 7 Years' War. They've just won the 7 Years' War. And there's this negativity, partly because of the history of free states. They're turbulent, they're problematic, they're faction-packed. Again, they replicate the history of Protestantism. Factions, division, fanaticism, and it looks like Britain's doing the same, especially with George III after 1760 and his changes to politics, especially his lack of a relationship with the Whigs. I'll finish in the next 5 minutes, but in fact I'm going to go over that. So the idea is that trade as a reason of state introduces elements of fantasy into the world, because if you're chasing money all the time, it means that you can rise and fall very, very quickly. There's going to be powerful consequences for social orders. You can be high and then you're low, you can be low and then you're high. But the danger is that your state becomes addicted to wars for the jealousy of trade. And the claim by the 1780s is that, by the 1770s, that exactly this has happened to Britain, and Britain has become what Adam Smith calls a mercantile system in the wealth of nations, so that Britain has become a corrupt commercial polity. And obviously what's Smith's definition of a mercantile system? It's a system where bankers and merchants are so wealthy that they bribe politicians to pass legislation for their profit rather than for the public good. And this notion of Britain being a mercantile system, it's illustrated here. Obviously, this is Warren Hastings, Governor General of Bengal, pouring the riches of the East into the Chancellor's stomach. The world economy rests on Bengal and Ireland, and the idea is it's going to explode. A stomach that large is not going to last. There's going to be death. Now, Obviously, Smith himself thought that Britain is overextended. It's actually a medium-sized power. It should adapt to the mediocrity of its circumstances. One of the purpose of the Wealth of Nations, which he thought was an attack on the British Empire. Now, one of the other things that Hont emphasised in the history of free states is that he argues that partly because of the Liberty War, because Britain and France fight a liberty war in the 1790s because of their two different notions of free states, and it's a war to the death. Obviously, it's interesting that, somebody like Burke and Payne, they both say, if we're going to have liberty in the world, we have to, obviously in Payne's case, fight a war to the death against Britain and destroy it. In Burke's case, fight a war to the death against the French Revolution and destroy it at all costs, even if it's the bankruptcy of Britain. But Hont thought that one of the consequences of this Liberty War, he blamed, and it's the British. Obviously, it's not caused by the French Revolution, but it's the nationalistic response, and the fact that ethno-nationalism emerges. So you have prints like this, whereas William Pitt is always a wimp, right? He's always depicted as weak and thin, but here he is, muscled and buff, with the chariot of liberty, getting rid of the forces of darkness. Obviously, anyone who supports the French Revolution. Now, I'm going to say a very last thing about Hont and Hont's approach to the history of liberty. It's slightly different to other scholars, because he thought that in the past you can find genuine solutions to problems. So it's not like Pocock's, or it's not like Skinner's, there's a lost tradition, or Pocock's, their world is our world. I mean, Hont did think their world is our world, but he also thought that they had solutions. And he thought that, and he became obsessed with the history of Scotland. This is somebody who is brought up in the Soviet Union. He is brought up in Budapest, and he ought to be writing, when he takes his doctorate, he ought to be doing Soviet-style history. But he writes a dissertation on David Hume and Scotland. And the reason that he writes about David Hume and Scotland is that he thinks the history of liberty, the history of free states, is not the history of Marxism, it's not the history of socialism, it's the history of Scotland. I know that that's something that it'll take time to convince you of. But the idea is that if you've got a world where small states are no longer functional because they're reliant on the economies of large states that want to control them, then you have to work out a way of keeping a small state without losing its liberty while allowing it to flourish. And Hont thought the example of this was Scotland. And the reason the example of it was Scotland, I'll see, here's again, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations explains it better than I could. By the union with England, the middling and inferior ranks of people in Scotland gained a complete deliverance from the power of an aristocracy which had oppressed them. So you've got rid of feudalism. So the union worked. At the union, the Scots keep their religious establishment, they keep their laws, and they keep their culture. What is extraordinary about the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century is that people are reading Walter Scott right across Europe, including the history of Scotland. And that's, people become obsessed with the history of Scotland at this point in time. I'm not going to finish with Montesquieu as I wanted to. I'm just going to say So Hont thought that the history of places like Budapest, which had a complicated relationship, obviously Holy Roman Empire, Austro-Hungary, that as a kind of lesser state that's part of a bigger state, you needed to fit that history into the history of relationships between smaller states and larger states in commercial environments, and he thought the best example was the Union. And the reason why the Genevans asked to become Scots is because, again, they thought the Union had worked, and if Geneva became a canton, but it remained Scottish, then it would keep its own laws, its own culture, its own religious establishment. Anyway, I'm going to finish on something negative. There's always a downside to this, and the downside is the mercantile system. And when the British attempt to do the same with the Irish, as has happened with the Scots, which obviously they do with the creation of the United Kingdom in 1800, here is William Pitt. Henry Dundas, who's obviously known as the King of Scotland, is inviting all of the Irish Parliament, men of the Parliament, the Protestant ascendancy, inviting them all to come over and jump into the imperial pouch, and they're going to get baubles and trinkets. It says, "Very snug and convenient, brother, I assure you," in there. And obviously Dundas, well-dressed and fleshy. Who loses by the creation of this mercantile system? The people, babies, even animals are upset. But also, it's all based on corruption. And an example of corruption is that Dundas is sitting on all of the sinecures that he is paid money for without having to do any work for. And it includes, I think it's Chancellor of the University of St Andrews, which I like very much.